Our first panellist today is Richard Jackson. Richard is the Director of the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies and a professor at the University of Otago. He is a researcher, writer, and public commentator on issues of terrorism and counter-terrorism. Richard, what was your initial response to the events at Newland Mall last Friday?
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for letting me go first. I didn't expect that, but yeah, look, the events were deeply saddening. It's always very, very difficult to see these kinds of events happen anywhere in the world, but obviously particularly in your own community. And while I was deeply saddened about this, I was also at the same time experiencing some deja vu, because I've been studying counterterrorism and the war on terror since at least 2005. And I've seen this pattern happen so many times in so many countries. And I think it's really important that we're having this event because, you know, terrorism is such an emotional thing that happens, and then there's a danger that we react, and that we react through the kind of prejudices of our society. We react through the fears and the narratives about threats and risks that we have already experienced. And sometimes the government is also then tempted to engage in a kind of knee-jerk reaction, to be seen to be doing something. And really what we need is to take a step back and consider the deeper issues. So yeah, these are my responses.
Awesome, thank you. Moving on, next up we have Anjum Rahman. She's a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit and a Muslim community leader based in Hamilton. She's the founding member of the New Zealand Women's Islamic Council, as well as Inclusive Aotearoa Collective. She's been an outspoken advocate against Islamophobia, racism, and the rise of the alt-right in Aotearoa. Anjum, would you be able to tell us what your initial response to the events at Newland last Friday were?
Yeah, absolute shock. I felt gutted for the victims. Couldn't even imagine, and not just, you know, the people that were directly impacted, the pain and what they've been going through, but also people who were present and had to witness all the first responders and law enforcement. Yeah, absolutely awful. Also that feeling of being re-traumatized, issues of PTSD, and of course I wasn't in Christchurch or at the mosques, or, you know, had not witnessed directly or watched the video, so I can only imagine for those people in the community how difficult that would have been for them as well.
Thank you, Anjum. Our next panellist is Andrew Geddis. Andrew is a professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Otago. After studying law at the University of Otago and Harvard, Andrew's research and teaching interests have focused on public law, democratic theory, and the legal regulation of elections. Andrew, would you be able to give us an insight into your initial response to the events at Newland Mall last Friday?
Yeah, rather than talking about my sort of personal feelings about what happened, which obviously shock and horror on multiple levels, I also experienced something of a deja vu, such as Richard related to, because in May of this year in the Countdown supermarket in Dunedin, we had a very similar incident. We had someone who took a knife and stabbed people in the supermarket, ran amok in the aisles. And looking at it objectively, you've got two events that involve the same thing, an individual person using a knife to hurt other people in a supermarket. And yet the reaction to these two things has been very, very different. With relation to the Otago attack, it's kind of, well, this is an isolated individual, the criminal law process will take care of them. With regard to the Newland attack, this is terror, it involves whole communities, it reflects on communities and so on. And it's just very interesting to reflect on why one incident is regarded as being so much more serious and so much more requiring a whole systemic societal response than the other. And I think that raises questions about, well, what is terrorism? Why do we see terrorism as being so bad? What makes one person being stabbed in one way objectively worse than another person being stabbed in another way, and so on. So I suppose from a sort of legal point of view, that was something that really interested me, and I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Andrew. Up next, we have Clarke Jones, who's a criminologist and Senior Research Fellow at the Research School of Psychology at the Australian National University. His research covers violent extremism, terrorism, radicalisation, community-led youth interventions, and prison gangs. Clarke, would you be able to give us your initial thoughts on the events at Newland last Friday?
Well, for me, being over here in Australia, I didn't hear about the incident until Saturday morning, and I heard just by reading it, so I wasn't directly impacted, but once again, as others have said, it was always a tragic incident and terrible to hear these sorts of things playing out. But I heard in the media reporting that it was a man of Sri Lankan background, and suddenly I thought, was it the case that I had worked on back in 2018? And then it was only probably an hour later that I got a text from the barrister who had represented Anthil Samsudeen. Excuse my pronunciation, terrible pronunciation. And straight away it was, this is terrible. While I feel terrible for the victims and the trauma that's caused to the victims, I also felt terrible in a situation that I think could have been, or quite possibly could have been prevented. That's one aspect, and I provided a report, an assessment to the courts back in 2018 of what really needed to happen. The other aspect, here we go again. We've got a situation that suddenly gets framed in, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later on, but framed in radicalisation, violent extremism, that sets it off in a pathway that, if it had taken a different pathway and treated as a mental health situation, and not thrown all the framing and the othering and all the other stuff that goes in that starts to demonise particular cultures and religious groups, then I'm just wondering whether this may have been prevented. So, shock and horror that these things go on, but in the work I do, working very closely with community groups in trying to prevent these sort of things, I'm always concerned about the framing, the othering, and the things that take place, and the alarmist approach that really, as Andrew was saying, we tend to have, there are stabbings that occur quite regularly in our major cities, and it's just interesting to see how they're treated and the way this was treated. Once again, we even had the Prime Minister of Australia ringing the Prime Minister of New Zealand saying, we stand with you, and all this.
Thank you, Clarke.
Just goes into overdrive. So yeah, shock and horror, but I just wonder this could have been prevented.
Thank you, Clarke, and I know we're going to hear a little bit more about your insight into that shortly with the question. Our final panellist is Shirley Achieng. Shirley is a PhD student at the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies. She is passionate about peace and security research and is keen on contributing to the discourse on counterterrorism and its role on national security policy development. Shirley, could you please share us your thoughts on the events of Newland last Friday?
Of course, it was quite a shocking event, given that the country at the time was at was on lockdown. That is alert level 4. It was quite surprising that this could actually even happen during level 4. For me, what really piqued my my interest in all this was the fact that, how is terrorism really understood in New Zealand, and what counts as terrorism and what doesn't count as terrorism. As Andrew has said, the incident that happened in Dunedin Countdown supermarket some months back. The person who actually stabbed people in Countdown was seen as a person who was suffering from mental health issues. But what was quite surprising for me is that the same person, you know, not the same person, but somebody else stabbing people in Auckland is seen as a terrorist. So I was really asking, is it because he was classified under ISIS, or is it really because of the incident that happened? How is terrorism really understood? And I felt that there's actually a gap in how terrorism is understood. The second thing that really interested me is about the New Zealand counterterrorism laws, in particular the Suppression of Terrorism Act of 2002. Given that this person, the perpetrator, actually has been walking free since 2016, despite a law being there, counterterrorism law being there. So how effective are these counterterrorism laws? Do they really fit within the reality of New Zealand's history? And it all boils back to, you know, how is terrorism seen? How is it understood by, you know, the New Zealand government?
Thank you, Shirley. And I know we're going to also touch on terrorism legislation towards the end of our discussion. We're going to move on to our second question now, and we're going to reverse the order to keep things fair. So we'll come back to you first, Shirley. Our question is, what perspectives do you feel are being sidelined in the current discourse that has arisen as a result of last week's Newland Mall attack?
I think for me, what I'll say is that the discourses that are being sidelined in this case is that you see the way terrorism has been seen over the years. Terrorism is actually, it's embedded, the whole terrorism discourse is embedded in the global war on terror discourse. And this discourse actually, you know, I don't think it's really working for many countries around the world, and New Zealand being a post-colonial state at that. Examining New Zealand's counterterrorism approach is actually, you actually see that it's not any different from the approaches that are being adopted by other post-colonial states around the world. This global war on terror discourse that really is embedded in New Zealand counterterrorism approach, I don't believe it's really working. I think it's basically counterproductive. And I think a nuanced approach to terrorism really needs to be a point of discussion, that the whole terrorism discourse needs to be reimagined anew, because it's not working for the country, given that imported approaches, imported models are being brought into the country and being forced to work just like they're working in other countries, for example, the UK, the US, and all these other countries. But are they really working for New Zealand in general, given that domestic terrorism in New Zealand is actually a subject that really needs to be examined?
Thank you so much for that, Shirley. That's a wonderful response, and we can't wait to hear more from you on that later. Up next is Clarke. So Clarke, what perspectives do you feel are being sidelined in the current discourse?
Thank you, Gabby. I think there are several issues from my perspective, and because of the way it's been framed, I think we need to, and knowing this case quite closely, I think there are several areas that were overlooked. Certainly, when the deceased had entered New Zealand, I mean, what were the refugee settlement sort of services available to him? So what actually happened in this case when he arrived? Had he slipped through the gaps to, you know, so really it's the sort of the early phases that are overlooked, and really looking now more at the sort of the security angle. overall mental health system, what was available to people in this case that have been highly traumatised in their backgrounds and then arriving into New Zealand. A large one that I spent a lot of time working on is once we knew and he'd been diagnosed with mental health issues, the correctional practices, and I don't want to sort of point blame at any agencies here because I see it as an overall, failure of the system. But the correctional practices of someone with mental health issues being put into a high security unit can only compound mental health issues. And so looking at correctional practices and how once someone is deemed a terrorist offender or someone involved in terrorism or violent extremism, we tend to automatically incarcerate them in high security units. And I'm just not sure in relation to rehabilitation and the way to effectively bring people back into society as effective members of society, we've just got it all wrong. And I say that from a number of perspectives, and I have specialised and looked at that for a long time now.
I think we do have our question to you will hopefully go a little bit deeper into what you're saying. And so we'll look forward to hearing that shortly.
Can I just make one other issue is the issue of Islamophobia and around treating one set of circumstances one way and another set of circumstances another way, and I'm deeply concerned about that.
Thank you for that final comment. Andrew, we'll come to you now with our second question. What perspectives do you feel are being sidelined in the current discourse that has arisen as a result of last week's Newland Mall attack? And I'll just remind our speakers, we'll try and keep our responses to 1 minute or less. Thank you.
I'm going to do better than that. I don't know and don't really feel able to comment on what we're not talking about, and I think there are probably others who are better able to do it, so I'll skip.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Up next we have Anjum. Sorry. If you know the question, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, thanks. So I was just reflecting that we haven't heard a perspective from Sri Lankan Muslims, or a lot of perspective. And having said that, the question is, and of course I'm no expert on Sri Lanka, and I see a couple of people on the call who could speak to this way better than me, but the question is how able they feel to speak around some of those issues. And I know from hearing from Muslims in Sri Lanka that things have been difficult there, that there are issues, and we're not hearing about that context. So that's one piece that I feel like is missing from this. The second thing is that, and this has been alluded to before, that there's a huge focus on immigration and counter-terrorism, and certainly not enough on corrections and justice. And I'll expand on that a bit more when we get to the next question.
Thank you, Anjum. I think we all echo that. Richard, will come finally to you and your perspective and your thinking on this question.
Great, thanks. I have 4 quick things to say. I think one of the things I haven't heard a lot about in the current sort of discourse is, questions around the effectiveness of current counterterrorism strategies and the suggested responses to this particular incident. So first of all, as Clarke mentioned, we have to think about the effectiveness of using the police and coercive forms of responding to potentially violent individuals, and ask whether they really work. And then secondly, we also have to ask the questions around, is a legislative response going to work either? I mean, what evidence is there that legislation works? Secondly, I haven't heard a lot about safeguarding of human rights in the suggested responses to this. There have been a lot of suggestions about how we could tighten the laws to be able to deport people or to surveil them or restrict their freedoms, but how do we protect human rights? I think that's got to be key. Thirdly, I think we've got to, one of the things we haven't really talked about are the broader causes of violence, in the sense that we have a view that individuals are these kind of like singular, isolated actors, but in actual fact, human beings are always shaped and related to and interconnected with the society that they're in. So in many ways, when there's an act of violence in a society, we have to ask questions about what kind of society is it that allows that to happen? And so what factors in our society are creating the conditions that lead to violence? And then finally, I think we have to ask questions around what does this incident reveal about our values and which lives we value? Because you might think about the fact that far more people are killed per year on average through domestic violence than they are in these kinds of events. Someone already raised this question. Why is it that some kinds of violence that are framed in some ways, why do they evoke a really, really particular kind of societal response, but other lives seem to be unworthy of that? And we're allowed, we let domestic abusers get away with a lot, but we don't want to allow any potential terrorists, as we call them, to get away with it. So these are some of the things that I think have been missing in the current debate.
Great, thank you, Richard. So from here, we're going to jump into questions aimed at individual panelists. So the format we have for this is the panelists the questions aimed at will get 3 minutes kind of maximum to articulate their response to the question. And after that time, we'll open the question up and ask if any of the other panelists would like to chime in or add their response or another perspective. And then finally, to wrap the question up, we'll bring the question back to the first speaker, just to give them a chance to conclude any remarks. So our first question is aimed at Clarke Jones. So Clarke, I read your excellent piece in The Guardian and found it to be a really timely reminder of the need for multidisciplinary responses to understand events of this nature. And I want to know, I guess perhaps overly simplistic narratives around radicalisation have been jumped on to explain the events at Newland.
Thank you. Look, I'm just quickly jumping to my notes here. The first thing when we say multidisciplinary approach, and I've seen the way the current discourse around the development of the countering violent extremism policy in New Zealand, and I suppose my deep concern is the lack of community engagement around the formulation of that policy. And I certainly received an email from a colleague from Auckland, from the Muslim community in Auckland, how they hadn't been consulted adequately in the development of that. So that's one aspect around this multidisciplinary approach. I'm just not sure whether we really engage the right people when we're developing these sort of securitized policies. But on the concept of radicalisation as a sort of a given phenomenon, there's no real agreement. I don't want to sort of get too much into the academic side, but certainly there's no real agreement around the term radicalisation, and it's certainly hotly debated. The way it's conceptualised, and it's as though there's just one single pathway for Muslim youth. I'm sorry to single this out, but that's the area I focus on. But Muslim youth, there's only one pathway, and that's towards, if they're highly devout or very conservative in their thinking, or whatever other factors go into other so-called radicalisation, that there's only one pathway, and that's the only outcome for disaffected, marginalised Muslim youth. And I just think that's just so off the mark. Once someone's deemed radicalised, then there's only one way or one solution in working with them, and that's de-radicalisation. And this is where we unfortunately get the conflation of Islam with terrorism. And I'm not a religious scholar, but certainly it's very un-Islamic around the use of violence, and we tend to lose concept, but we get carried away with this whole radicalisation discourse. It also has a way of demonising, sort of I was touching on that a little bit, demonising particular groups and creating othering and suspect communities, because a large proportion of the population don't have the insights that we do, or I do, and they so then tend to frame particular sections of society as suspicious. And I think it, really in this case, it's really covered the real issues around mental health and overall, massive failure of the system. And, if it was handled differently, I think we wouldn't have been here today. And I did touch on it slightly before. If someone is deemed radicalised, there's a set of actions that are going to train around radical ideology, and then the way they're going to be treated. After incarceration, it's high police surveillance, whereas you really wonder whether that energy could have been directed towards reintegration strategies and other mechanisms to support to prevent reoffending. But it appears as though the response or the deceased was given contact to a Muslim community in Auckland, and somehow they were going to then provide a solution to the problem. But once released, I think it was too late. She cried, and I think because of the discourse and the way it went, a lot of the things that should have been done were overlooked.
All right, thank you very much for that, Clarke. I'll now throw the question to the rest of our panelists. If there's anything that Clarke said that you want to respond to or add on more information, now would be your time.
I'll just respond to the last little bit. Like, this is something that we're asking for more information on, why he was put in that particular community. There was misinformation around where he was housed because he wasn't in the mosque itself, but in accommodation on the complex. But that community and that mosque was not well resourced. We don't know what resourcing was provided, where we have a well-established organisation that had already had contact with corrections, but they didn't then have any further conversations at the time the person was coming out of jail and being put into community. There are just a whole lot of questions of what happened and how it happened and what support was in place that are raising huge concerns.
Thank you very much, Anjum. Again, you raised an excellent point. Just any final remarks from anyone? Otherwise, I will send it back to Clarke.
So, did you ask me a question, sorry?
I'm just seeing if any of the other panelists have any. We'll go back to you, Clarke, if you have any concluding thoughts on this.
No, I just, it's to place responsibility on the community. I mean, certainly in Australia, there's all sorts of things around concepts of co-design and working closely with communities if they want that sort of support or wants that sort of response or want to be involved in a program. But I just think there are so many, cultural nuances or religious nuances, and actually getting the right fit for a person or a youth working with a community or working with a service provider, it's quite complex and it doesn't always work. And there's a lot of gaps certainly in my knowledge, but I was working with a barrister who's from the Muslim community, and I had some contact, and so I hear what Anjum was saying, and I just really wonder about the type of community engagement and what's actually going on, and what's the level of trust, and I always talk about mutual respect as well. There are lots of things to do to engage communities, and also making sure they've got the capacity and that they actually really want to do that sort of thing and work on that in that space. Certainly with the communities I work with in Australia, it's taken me a good 4 years to develop those sorts of relationships, to be able to work on sort of sensitive criminal law, antisocial sort of issues. So I think I appreciate New Zealand's a bit of in the infancy in this area, but it sounds like there's a lot of work to go.
Thank you, Clarke. I certainly agree. The need for a diverse approach, and an approach where communities are essential is needed. Anjum, we're going to come to you now with our individual question. It's been exactly a week since the events at Newland Mall, and I suspect that the vast majority of New Zealanders have made up their mind about the nature of what took place and why it happened. For most people, this is largely a result of the immediate media reporting following the attack. This has shown just how important the media's role is in forming New Zealanders' understanding of issues such as this. My question, therefore, to you, Anjum, is how do we ensure that the media is publicising helpful narratives in the response to events such as last Friday and representing all people involved humanely?
Thank you for that. And my overall response is that we do that by engaging with media and by using our own voices to counter what might be harmful framing or discourse. And you can engage with the media through letters to the editor, through offering to write an opinion piece, through contacting reporters that you see that are reporting the issue. But I did want to then within that talk about some of the things that you could counter. So I mentioned, and others have mentioned, this focus on immigration and counter-terrorism and not enough on corrections and justice. And in terms of the immigration status, you know, I understand that we want to make sure we're not bringing in people who are problematic, but there's no indication that this person was problematic when he got here. And the focus on deportation, you know, I'm glad someone mentioned human rights. I mean, there's a major issue of deporting our problems. And you know that Australia is doing this to us, is they're deporting their own problems to New Zealand rather than doing the work and putting in the investment that they should be doing and requiring us to do that. To have this deportation mentality of we'll just send this person somewhere else so that he can harm other people that we don't care about is really awful. But secondly, all indications seem to be that his thinking was formed in this country, therefore we have a responsibility to deal with it. And we actually have to get it right. We have to get our response right and provide proper responses for people that are vulnerable, that get caught into traps, the algorithms that are pulling them into spaces where they shouldn't be. And then the other area of concern is providing some context around this, around his thinking, his ideology, and we're not getting a lot of that context. So, you know, if you want to do these de-radicalization programs, how does that work in a colonial country and within a white supremacist framework effectively when we're not talking about an illegal war in Iraq that was based on lies, where nobody has been held accountable who was telling those lies, where we've actually got George Bush given a major platform this weekend rather than any kind of accountability, facing any court for, you know, even basic things like claiming that Al-Qaeda was in Iraq and using that as a pretext for an illegal invasion. All of those things are the context around which this happens. And when you don't have responses, when countries are not taking ownership for the profiteering of sale of arms and all the other things that are happening in this context, how do you de-radicalize? And you can still, but we need to make sure that we're putting that context in place. And because we don't have all of this, what it leads to is that rush response, that we jump to counter-terrorism legislation, which I did a submission to the current bill that's passed its first reading. It has major issues. I'd be really concerned if it was rushed through the House and passed as is. Almost, you know, the majority of our counter-terrorism legislation has been pushed through under urgency. The whole thing needs a review. We need an independent legislative body. We need evidence to show whether or not these measures are working, and if they're not, to remove them. But, you know, what we're talking about because of the media narratives is counter-terrorism legislation, our refugee legislation, immigration, and we're not talking about justice system reform, rehabilitation, what is remand, how long does it take to get cases through, was this the best piece of legislation, were charges in 2016 the answer, or was there another answer, was there a community sentence and an alternatives to violence program or something else that might have worked at that time that would have been effective? We're not talking about anything of that nature because, you know, as you said in the question, the narratives have been set and we do need to push back on some of this.
Thank you so much for that, Anjum. I think in terms of time, we are going to have to get moving, so I don't have time to ask for your responses. But if this is something that the other panelists feel they want to contribute on. Hopefully there's some time for that at the end. My next question is to Richard. Richard, in the last couple of months, we've seen the threat of violence manifest itself in public spaces. This has led some people to feel afraid and question what we need to do to make those spaces safe again. As the other panelists have mentioned, there was that issue in the supermarket in Dunedin that wasn't given a terrorist label. And I'm wondering, given your work in the critical terrorism sphere, what do you feel we need to do to approach the issue of safety in public spaces?
Well, first of all, you know, banning knife sets in supermarkets is clearly not a really serious or useful thing to do. It's not appropriate or sufficient because, you know, first of all, it doesn't deal with the fact that almost anything in society, you know, from cars and easily available chemicals and cricket bats and anything can be used as a weapon for any determined attacker. And then also it doesn't deal with the reasons why people want to commit political violence. And I think, you know, we've had 20 years of a war on terror where there's been an attempt to try and use force and security measures to try and stop people from being able to attack. But that clearly hasn't worked. And really what we need to think about is, how do we create a society and how do we find ways of dealing with people that will deal with the reasons why they want to attack and attack this and sort of try to deal with this at source rather than the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff trying to stop people from, you know, who are right on the edge of being wanting to attack. I think more broadly on this kind of issue about the nature of risk and the nature of threats, we need a deeper discussion about how we conceptualize and approach risks and threats, how we want to respond to those, whose lives we consider really worthy of saving and protecting, and whose lives we're often willing to, you know, to suffer risks. We need to question ourselves. Why is it that we really want to protect public spaces, but we're willing to let private spaces like people's intimate homes, where a lot of intimate violence occurs, be unsafe? You know, why is it that we, as someone mentioned, that we place a high premium on preventing victims of terrorism, but less premium on preventing victims of domestic violence, for example? These things reveal to us that our approach to risk and dangers and threats are in many ways filtered through our values. And we have to ask hard questions about our values. And in this case, we have to ask hard questions about how, yeah, the institutional and cultural racism that's a part of our society, the Islamophobia, the prejudice towards people with mental illness, and these things frame our perceptions of risk. But then we also need to think about how our values frame the way we think about responses to threats and the use of state violence. And the fact that, for example, the police actually do kill a lot of people in trying to protect society, and the way in which we've gone to war and caused violence overseas, and what effect that might have on our society. So, you know, there's the colonial mindset as well, where we think that if we use enough force and if we have enough strict measures, we can control the situation, we can subdue, you know, the violence that's out there. There's the war on terror mindset. There's the role of the media that also shapes our perceptions of risk and our fears about crime and about violence and so on. We need to have deeper questions about these before jumping into a kind of simple knee-jerk reaction, which says, you know, the only way to protect ourselves is to be able to deport all the bad people.
Thank you, Richard. I certainly agree the need to problematize the issues of how we respond to terrorism and attacks such as this. I wish we had time, Anjum and Richard, you both mentioned the can of worms that is the war on terror and America's response. Maybe we'll save that for another day. Andrew, going to come now to you. You have written on legislation around counter-terrorism in the past and in connection to these events, including in the spin-off last week. After observing the events of last Friday, do you think legislative change is an appropriate response? And if so, how far is it appropriate for the law to go in responding to terrorism threats?
Well, one thing that I think is important to note at the outset is that the proposed changes that are before Parliament at the moment wouldn't appreciably have altered either this attack in Newland or the Christchurch attack. The Christchurch Royal Commission found that, you know, a precursor offence of planning a terrorist attack, you wouldn't have been able to catch the Christchurch terrorist under that because there was just no indication he was planning before he went off and did what he did. Similarly with the Newland attack, at the time the attacker bought a knife and there was some indication he maybe planned to use it in an attack. That was back in 2018. Even if an offence had been on the book and he had been charged with that, he then served the next 3 years in prison anyway, awaiting trial and sentencing. If there'd been an offence in place and he was charged, he'd have probably got that sentence and he'd be back up on the street anyway. So the ability to use legislation and criminal law to stop these sort of attacks is just not clear that it's actually going to work. And the problem with introducing offences such as the proposed one of planning or preparing for a criminal terrorist attack is you have to work out where exactly that stops in a person's practices. I mean, is looking stuff up on the internet, is taking photos of a place, is writing a diary with, some thoughts about what you might do if certain things happen. It's very hard to know exactly at what point that becomes criminal. And perhaps just one final point is, in our criminal law, it's not an offence to plan or prepare any other sort of criminal act. So if a person buys a gun and writes in a diary, I plan to use this gun to shoot my wife, that's not an offence. So it will only be this one particular form of act that will be criminalised. And why is it we're picking this one form of act out to broaden our criminal law to catch? And again, that I don't think has really been debated. It's just felt this is terrorism, it's bad, therefore it must be okay to do this. But it would be nice to see some more discussion on that.
Thank you, Andrew. We might have one more moment if anybody else has a response to that question on legislation.
No, that was very well said.
Great, we'll move on to the final question. Thank you, Gabby.
All right, my final question is for Shirley. Shirley, given your work on the importance of terrorism discourse and the effect that this has on shaping public policy, I want to ask what you believe we can all do as, not only the panelists here, but the participants who've come along. What do you believe we can do to bring better discourse into the conversation around events such as what happened in Newland?
Okay. From that incident, you can see that, looking at the New Zealand counterterrorism landscape, you can see that there are several discourses that surround this kind of context. And last week's incident certainly brought issues such as Islamophobia to the fore, which definitely arises from the us versus them ideology that demonizes sections of society. And this is actually what is dominant in the current terrorism discourse. And we know that because of issues such as Islamophobia, incidences like the terrorism attack of Christchurch managed to take place. So looking at all these and having conversations around all these discourses to bring a better discourse for me would involve working towards the development of a nuanced approach to counterterrorism that fits within the reality of New Zealand's counterterrorism and reflects its history. And when I speak about a nuanced approach, for that matter, I mean an approach that invokes the colonial epistemic perspective and creates space for other kinds of knowledges, creating an environment where there's pluriversality of knowledge is such that only one knowledge, that is the global war on terror ideology, doesn't really take the center stage as is seen now in the current counterterrorism framework for New Zealand. And as I said before, like considering that New Zealand is a post-colonial country, I think this ideology that they've adopted, I think it needs to be reimagined anew, and conversations need to happen around all these discourses that are affecting a New Zealand's terrorism landscape, as it were, so that if it's about a reevaluation of how the laws are to be looked into, if it's about conversations of Islamophobia, if it's about questions of human rights, all these things need to be looked into so that a specific and a nuanced approach is able to be adopted, an approach that is working, an approach that reflects what everybody stands for, because there is no point of having an approach whereby other sections of society sees it as maybe double standards, because there are people who think that from last week's terrorism event, maybe some questions of double standards have come up on how the government handles the issues of terrorism in the country. When it's an Australian citizen or it's a citizen of New Zealand, maybe it's not seen as terrorism when they stab people, but when it's an outsider coming from another country, then automatically it becomes terrorism. So these are the questions that on my side, I think need to be reevaluated, and a nuanced approach, adopted for the country.
Thank you so much, Shirley. I really loved what you said about how we need to, I guess, make our values known and make sure that we are having those discussions with one another. I'm wondering, do any of our other panelists have anything to add in on that about what we as everyday people can do to shape terrorism discourse?
I just wanted to add a quick perspective from my involvement with the Christchurch Call Advisory Network and the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And one of the major topics of discussion in these international forums is the fact that there is no settled definition of terrorism, and how difficult it is to get agreement around what that definition might be, who gets to define it, and from what perspective. And I think that certainly that kind of discussion needs to be had within our communities as well. The reason why it's important at Christchurch Call and so on is because those are the definitions that are then used to take down material. So whether we're banning the video of the live stream attack, whether we're banning photographs or other material, what counts and comes under that definition of being taken down or prevented from being uploaded becomes absolutely critical. And I think that as a country, within the general population, we certainly haven't had enough discussion around that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anjum. We've got some audience questions that have come through, and the first one is again aimed at you. I hope you don't mind talking twice in a row. But Anjum, one of our audience members has noticed that you talked to people's experiences with corrections, and they've asked what changes you and our other members would like to see in how corrections in the justice system deals with people before or after time in court on charges. I think this question is a bit broader than just suspected of terrorism.
Was that for me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think if we look at this particular example, so this person was on remand for, months on end. I'm thinking it was around 2 or 3 years, like he got out of jail from on remand. While on remand, there was no option to take part in any kind of rehabilitation programs because that's not offered. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at. I think also, and we know this from the family violence space, that there's a whole range of programs out there. Some are really a waste of space, and many are more effective than not. And so our thinking around what is effective, how do we encourage people in a situation like this to engage with those programs, you know. So there's that knowledge base that sets in of how do we get them to engage, what is effective engagement like, and how are we dealing with the context within these people's lives and the injustices they're seeing, and giving them some ways to act on those injustices that aren't violence towards innocent people. Then there's the whole issue around mental health support, and we know so many of people in our prisons are there because of mental health issues, because the mental health system just isn't dealing with them well or doesn't have the capacity. So I think there's a whole range of stuff that can be done. And then, of course, having that cultural context, the co-design of those programs, and the investment at the front end, and trying to interact with people early on for those smaller sentences rather than waiting until they're down the track. And we know that prison itself radicalizes people. And that's not with terrorism, that's just with, you know, because they're in this environment that it isn't conducive to well-being in any way. It isn't conducive to them improving their lives in any way and coming out and being able to live their lives differently. So yeah, there's a lot of work and a lot of investment that needs to happen, and those programs need to be appropriate within the context of people's lives. So having this kind of one size fits all mentality to solutions is just ridiculous, and it doesn't work. We need to move to notions of equity, to notions of people need to be treated differently for their different circumstances, because we want stuff to work.
Thank you, Anjum.
Could I just add to that?
Clarke?
Yeah, just
briefly from you.
Just really quickly, I've spent probably the last 15 years looking at prison-based programs in this, and work very closely with high-risk offenders. And the first thing we've got to realise is when someone's in remand, it's very difficult to run programs because of the human rights issue and the right to fair trial, and having to the admission of guilt to get effective programs. So we've got to, but I think prison time, if it's going to be used, it's got to be used effectively, and they've got to be engaged. The other aspect, getting back to this case, is he was highly problematic inside the system. But I'm always interested in how we can better engage offenders. Is really crucial. As Anjum mentioned, around cultural and religious backgrounds and getting the match right for that treatment. But isolation is never going to be good for anyone, and the framing that's used in this offence, I think it's a disaster waiting to happen. The prison time just made his situation a whole lot worse because they did not address the problems, and I think corrections probably do, without pointing the finger at them, need to revisit on how they do things, not just in New Zealand, but in Australia and the Philippines, where I work as well. We just don't get it right. We just don't get it right because, we've seen programs in other countries just totally fail, but yet we want to model those, the new programs on those programs which have that have failed in the past. And we just don't understand responsivity and how is a program designed or co-designed, and how do we get people wanting to be part of those programs? I don't think we understand that yet. And it does come down to a lot of trust building and relationship building and mutual respect, and a few fundamental issues which we are yet to understand because of this framing.
Thank you for those comments, Clarke. And unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap ourselves up there. It's been a great privilege to hear from all of our esteemed speakers today, and we thank you so much for joining us. The discussion has been particularly insightful, and I know for myself, my understanding and appreciation for the complexity of the issues of media and how we respond to terrorism, the silence on the discourse, and the way we involve the community in our approach has been enlightened and enhanced by all of your comments, and very appreciative for that. And I would also like to apologise to the audience. I know we have a number of great questions which we're unable to ask to our panellists today, but I know each of them are accessible online. They have different various pages and blogs. You can find them in the media. So maybe if you have some time to do some searching, you'll find some of your answers may already have been written or said by some of our panelists. On behalf of Gabby and Kaylee, Oscar, Adam and I and the National Centre of Peace and Conflict Studies, thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much to our panelists, Anjum, Clarke, Andrew, Shirley and Richard. It's been a real pleasure to partake in this discussion with you. And we really hope we can continue this discourse, broaden and create a holistic response to terrorism, and think critically about the way we respond to issues such as the Newland Mall attack last week.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
that was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.